Hello, my name is Sophia Mannion Boylson, and welcome to Disastrophie. Here I discuss disasters, true crime, what have you, all while I create a piece of art. Today I'm going in depth about the worst 24 hours in the history of the second highest mountain, K2. Collectively, it is referred to as the K2 2008 incident. This story starts with several teams of climbers, and I would like to note that this is not all the climbers, high-altitude porters, and Sherpas there that day. This is just some. From Norway, there were Lars Nessa, Cecile Skog, and Rolf Bae. A team calling themselves Norrit were Wilco van Reugen, Cas van de Gevel, Gerard McDonnell, and Pemba Gyalji Sherpa. There was a Korean team containing Kyung Hyo Park, Hyo Gyong Kim, Dong Jin Hwang, along with two Sherpa cousins, Pasang Bote and Jumik Bote, as well as the team leader, Mr. Kim. From an international team were Eric Mayer and Frederick Strang. From Serbia, Dren Mandik, Predrag Zagorak, and Iso Planik. From France was Hugues Diobrede, accompanied by a high-altitude porter from Pakistan named Karim Meherban. Also on the mountain were two soloists, one from Spain named Alberto Zerain, and one from Italy named Marco Carfantola. The story takes place on the second highest mountain known as K2. K2 is 8,610 meters, 28,250 feet tall, located in the Karakoram mountain range straddling the border between Pakistan and China. Historically, K2 is more dangerous than Everest with a higher death rate. For every 4 climbers that attempt K2, 1 will die trying. It seems every mountain has a human-like name, but not K2. The mountain was first surveyed in 1856, where it was first labeled K2. As the Oxford Dictionary states, K2 stands for Karakoram 2 because it was the second peak to be surveyed in the trigonometrical survey in the Karakoram system. When the British Survey went to Pakistan and China to survey the Karakoram range, they would get the altitude of a particular mountain and label it with a K, followed by a number. Names like K1, K2, K3, and so on. Then they would go to the locals to see if it had a local name. For example, K1 was called Masherbrum, and K3 became Broad Peak. K2 was so remote that it had no local name, thus the name stuck. Like many other mountains, however, it has a multitude of nicknames and titles. The Savage Mountain, Mount Godwin-Austen, which is personally my least favorite. No one really calls it that. It's such a dumb name. King of Mountains, the Mountaineers Mountain, the Mountain of Mountains, and Chagori. It was the last 8,000-meter tall peak to be summited in winter by a group of Nepalese climbers led by Nirmal Persia and Mingma Gyalji Sherpa. As of February 2021, only 377 people have reached the summit. 91 deaths occurred during these attempted climbs and descents. It is not statistically the most dangerous 8,000er. That title usually goes to Annapurna, the 10th highest mountain in the world. When it comes to the 2008 incident, there are many specific details that remain unclear, and there are many different plausible scenarios, but little to no concrete proof. Several climbing groups got together at Camp 4 during the night of July 31st, 2008. The many groups on the mountain had decided to work together, or at least try to help each other get to the summit. At around midnight, the high-altitude porters and Sherpas started preparing the fixed lines. They were joined later on by Alberto Zerain. The leader of the Korean team, Mr. Kim, allegedly agreed to wake up early to prepare fixed ropes, but for reasons unknown, he didn't. The most experienced high-altitude porter, Shaheen Beg, had to go down early due to high-altitude sickness. He was the only person of the collective teams to have previously summited K2. In the confusion, without Shaheen Beg's leadership and experience, the ropes may have been placed too far down the slope or left behind entirely. At 3 a.m., the majority of the climbers started up. They ran out of rope around the traverse for the bottleneck. The bottleneck is a narrow couloir overhung by a massive sérac east of the summit. The sérac is prone to collapse and often sends chunks of ice and snow down the slope towards unsuspecting climbers. Running out of rope here meant that the climbers were forced to take the rope from the lower portions for the higher portions, and doing this caused a serious unplanned delay. At this point in the climb, Eric Mayer, Frederick Strang, Chris Klinke, and Jael Staleman all turned back. By 10 a.m., there was a traffic jam in the bottleneck. To put it lightly, this was not a place you wanted to move slowly. You wanted to move quickly here to avoid the ice. Dren Mandic from Serbia unclipped his harness from the fixed rope. His oxygen mask was most likely acting up and he had to step off the trail to deal with it. However, as he attempted to pass Cecile Skog, he slipped and fell either 200 meters, 656 feet, or 100 meters, 328 feet. Sources went back and forth. Some climbers at Camp 4 thought they could see him moving, but he fell again and didn't move after. The group at Camp 4 sent a group to help recover Mandic. Frederick Strang took command of the recovery operation, but by the time he got there, Predrag Zagarak, Isoplanik, and high-altitude porter Mohammed Hussein had already arrived and pronounced Dren Mandic dead. They decided to bring his body down to Camp 4. They were joined in their efforts by a high-altitude porter from the French team, Jihan Beg. Strang and several others previously noticed Beg was probably suffering from high-altitude sickness. He was almost incoherent, first offering to help them with the body, then refusing, and then coming back to help again. During descent, Beg slipped and fell, still holding on to a rope connected to Mandic's body and the other 4 climbers. Strang urged him to release the rope, which he did. But strangely, he did not use the self-arrest technique to stop his fall. A self-arrest is usually done with an ice axe in the event that a climber begins to fall down a slope. When you fall, you generally want to plant the axe in the snow at about shoulder height of the arm you are holding it in. At the same time, you want to grab the handle with the opposite hand. Then you almost want to push out like you're doing a push-up to get your body off of the snow while digging your toes in. This technique has a 50% chance of stopping a fall. Jihan Beg did not perform this maneuver and subsequently fell to his death. Strang, Zagarak, Planik, and Hussein then aborted their attempt to bring Mandic's body down. Around this time, Nicholas Rice also aborted his summit attempt. The delays in the bottleneck resulted in a much later summit time than is safe. The last climber reached the summit at around 7:30 p.m. Nightfall fell around 8:30 before many could get to the fixed lines and start descending. Sometime during the night, the sérac fell for the first time. Note the phrase, first time. This first icefall cut the fixed lines and took with it the Norwegian climber Rolf Baye. Baye had abandoned the summit attempt 100 meters, 330 feet, below the summit. He waited below for his wife, Cecile Skog, and friends, Lars Nessa, to descend with him. Baye had gone slightly ahead of Skog and Nessa, with his last words being told as, "Lars, I will go first. You look after my wife." One moment he was ahead of them both, then with a rush of ice, he was gone. Somehow, Nessa and Skog managed to continue down to Camp 4 that night. Without the fixed ropes, traversing the bottleneck became much harder. Some climbers tried to go down anyway, and others decided to bivouac above the Surak for the night. Pemba Gyalji Sherpa reached Camp 4 before midnight without the fixed ropes. Sherpa Chiring Dorje descended the bottleneck with Little Pasang Lama strapped to his harness. Little Pasang Lama had given his axe to another climber in need. In a truly selfless and brave act, Chiring Dorje short-roped Little Pasang Lama to his own safety harness. He chipped his way along the bottleneck and, with one ice axe, belayed them both. At one point they began to fall, but luckily the ice axe stuck into a tiny crack in the ice that stopped their fall. Eventually, the two of them reached Camp 4. Kim Jae-soo and Go-mi Young managed to find their way down with the help of Chiring Bote and Big Pasang Bote. Chiring Bote and Big Pasang Bote were supposed to summit the next morning. During the night, Cass van de Gevel and Hughes Diabrede decided to maneuver the bottleneck in the dark. Once Van de Gevel reached the base of the bottleneck, he witnessed a climber falling to his death. This event was corroborated by Chiring Bote and Big Pasang Bote. This climber was probably Diabrede, as he had run out of oxygen earlier, and as Van de Gevel passed him, he reported that the French national looked tired and that he insisted he descend before him. Above the bottleneck, Gerard MacDonald, Wilco van Ruygen, and Marco Confortola all bivouacked together. Confortola claims during the night that he heard screaming and saw headlights disappear below him after a roaring in the ice field. On the morning of August 2nd, a rescue group was sent up with ropes. The group included Sherpas Chiring Bote and Big Pasang Bote. The two went up to search for their relative Jumik Bote, who was stranded with Korean members above the bottleneck. In the early morning, Wilco van Ruygen gave up his search for the fixed ropes and began to descend alone. His vision was beginning to deteriorate. He was scared that he could go snowblind. At such a high altitude, snow blindness was a deadly risk he did not want to take. Marco Confortola and Gerard MacDonald did not follow immediately. Van Ruygen eventually reached the remaining Korean climbers and their guide, Jumik Bote. The men had been entangled in their ropes and had been hanging, some upside down, through the night. All three were alive. It's unclear if they were victims of the second Surak fall, or just through a regular fall. Some sources say that there were only 2 Koreans in Jumik Bote, while others say it was 3 Koreans and Jumik Bote. Van Ruygen handed Jumik Bote a spare pair of gloves, but he was unable to help more. He claims Jumik Bote told him rescue was coming from Camp 4, so he kept descending. Later that day, MacDonald and Confortola reached the Korean group and spent several hours attempting to help them. Confortola claims that after an hour and a half, give or take, MacDonald suddenly began climbing up higher. He says that he assumed the Irishman was suffering from high-altitude sickness, so he went down by himself. Before he left, he radioed Chiring Bote and Big Pasang Bote, who were on their way up. Van Ruygen and many others dispute what happened to MacDonald. He probably didn't climb up the mountain, but up to the highest anchor point, supporting the men to transfer the load. Then, most likely, he came back and spent several more hours alone, helping free the men from the ropes. Confortola stated sometime after he left, an avalanche struck just feet away. In the remains, he spotted a body of a climber, and he assumed this was MacDonald. Just after noon, Chiring Bote and Big Pasang Bote reached the bottom of the bottleneck and found Confortola crawling on his hands and knees. They radioed Pemba Gyalji, and he and Cass van de Gevel came up for Confortola. Later, Tsering Bote and Big Pasang Bote radioed Gyalji that they had met Jamik Bote and the 2 other Korean climbers at the top of the bottleneck. They radioed that there was a 4th climber with them, but they had been swept down by a 3rd Serac fall. A description of the red and black downsuit matched McDonald's downsuit. This supports the timeline of events in which Gerard McDonald successfully freed the Korean group. In this scenario, Confortola must have been mistaken in identifying the body he saw. Tsering Bote, at the base of the bottleneck, witnessed the Serac fall for a 4th time and strike the rescue group at the top of the bottleneck. Along with the true events surrounding McDonald's death, another mystery is the fate of high-altitude porter Meherban Karim. He was last seen descending from the summit with Diabrede. Diabrede was the only climber that Cas van de Gevel saw during his descent, so at some point during the night, the 2 must have separated. There is a theory that Karim bivouacked higher than Van Ruygen, McDonald, and Confortola. Van Ruygen provided photos taken by Pemba Gyalji Sherpa that could show a climber seen above the Serac field. A later photo showed the figure had disappeared and a trail leading down the Serac field. He could have been disoriented from a long night in the death zone and may have gotten lost and stumbled down into the Serac field. He might have accidentally caused one of the Serac falls. It is possible that Karim's body was the one that Confortola saw. In Graham Bowley's book, No Way Down, he was unable to refute the photographic evidence, but he clearly states that they are inconclusive at best. He is joined in his analysis by writer Michael Kodas. Both edge towards believing Confortola's version of events. It should be noted that in Pemba Gyalji Sherpa's photos, individual climbers cannot be made out. Some figures assumed to be climbers could be rocks, and there are marks that look like trails everywhere on the mountain. I'm going to break in here with my personal opinion. I've seen these pictures, and I think it's pretty clear that you can see there was a climber up there, and then suddenly there wasn't. I personally do not think that the particular climber that they are talking about, that particular spot, I do not think that was a rock. I believe that was probably Karim before he passed. Confortola's statements are conflicting at best. At Milan Airport, after he was airlifted off the mountain, he claims that he had freed the Korean group when it was most likely McDonald. He also could have misidentified Karim's body for McDonald's. He stated he and McDonald saw climbers being swept away during the night and decided to bivouac until morning, and Van Ruygen joined them later. Van Ruygen says they were together the entire time. A lot of his story was later refuted by both Van Ruygen and Gyalji. Part of the reason Confortola's story was believed so early on was because he was the first of the climbers to speak to the media. It is also possible that Big Pasang Bote was mistaken in the color of the downsuit. Karim wore an almost all-red downsuit, while McDonald wore a red and black downsuit. Minutes after Big Pasang Bote radioed Gyalji, the Serac fell for a 4th time. This was the event that Tsering Bote witnessed. Since he, Confortola, Van de Gevel, and Gyalji were at the base of the bottleneck, the 4 were able to survive. Meanwhile, Van Ruygen was making his way down a new route just left of the main route, ending up bypassing Camp 4. Van de Gevel and Gyalji descended from Camp 4 to Camp 3 using satellite radio calls to pinpoint Van Ruygen's location. He spent a second night bivouacking on the mountain, and as a result he suffered 3rd-degree frostbite to his feet. Wilco van Ruygen is one of the only people to survive 2 days above the 8,000-meter death zone in the open air. That Saturday morning, contact was able to be made with Van Ruygen. He was found and managed to get down to base camp by 10 p.m. Van de Gevel and Van Ruygen were both evacuated by helicopter from base camp. Confortola was airlifted from Camp 2 the next day. After K2, Marco Confortola wrote a book called Days of Ice. Gerard MacDonald's family established a charity to sponsor the children of the high-altitude porters that died on K2. His brother-in-law, Damien O'Brien, wrote a book called The Time Has Come. For his heroics, Chiring Dorje Sherpa was given the Tenzing Norgay Award at the Explorers Club annual banquet in March 2013. Pemba Gyalji Sherpa was named National Geographic's Adventurer of the Year in 2008. Wilco van Ruygen wrote a book called Surviving K2. In the summer of 2017, Alberto Zerain was killed on Nanga Parbat along with his climbing partner Mariano Galvan in an avalanche. In January 2010, Cecile Skog finished the first unassisted and unsupported crossing of Antarctica. And now, my personal thoughts. I'm going to make it clear, I'm not a climber, could never be a climber. Altitude and I don't get along, and honestly, I'm not physically or mentally strong enough to be a climber. I do, however, have mad respect for people who can. I chose this topic because it was the subject of one of the first mountaineering documentaries I've ever watched, The Summit, back when it was still on Netflix. I first became interested in mountaineering after reading the book Peak by Roland Smith. Being the nerd I am, I looked more into it. I found The Summit and Nightmare on Everest, a documentary about the 2015 Nepal earthquake and what happened at base camp on Everest. I may do a separate episode of that later. I was inspired to create a series of characters based off of the mountains. I held on to the K2 2008 incident, deciding that the event would be my starting point for the character of K2. I know most people would probably turn the mountain into an evil, conniving person that takes joy in harming people, but that is not the route I took. K2, like any other mountain, is not there to actively hurt you. It's literally just a giant fixture of rock, snow, and ice that sticks up into the lower atmosphere. If an avalanche happens, it happens. Gravity doing its thing. If people get in the way, well, it's not like an avalanche has brakes or sentience to change course. So the character of K2 I have he's just like you or me. He tries to keep to himself and doesn't want to hurt anybody. But enough about that. Even when I first watched The Summit and didn't have a good idea of what kind of factors came together, I can only describe it as one accident after another. Accident after accident. Everyone has their opinions on what caused what, but it was probably just bad timing. Nobody knew that the Serac would fall down once, much less 4 times. Nobody knew the fixed ropes would vanish during the night. Nobody knew Dren Mandik would have to step off to the side of the trail to fix his oxygen system. Nobody knew he and Jihan Beg would fall. No one knew an icefall would take Rolf Baye along with the fixed ropes. No one knew that huge Diabrade would fall during the night. No one knew Kyung Hyo Park, Hyo Gyeong Kim, Dong Jin Hwang, and Jumik Bote would get tangled in their climbing lines. No one knew Meherban Karim would vanish without nearly a trace. No one knew that after freeing the Korean group, Gerard MacDonald would get hit by ice. No one knew that the same group he helped rescue would be killed in yet another icefall along with Pasang Bote. No one knew the controversy that would come in the following years, putting an entire livelihood under the spotlight to be scrutinized once more by non-experts. I'll close out this episode with a poignant quote from Gerard MacDonald that also ended the documentary The Summit. Oftentimes, when someone does lose a life, what went down is held, up under the microscope. Some people might say, oh, they should have done this and they shouldn't have done that. Just because you survived the mountain doesn't make you an expert, and I don't think that it gives you any right to say somebody made a mistake, Because you just, when you weren't there, you don't know. Only the mountain knows. Hey guys, thanks for checking out this episode of Disastrophie. If you want, like, comment, share, subscribe, do what you feel like. I am hoping to make this a weekly thing, or maybe every 2 weeks if the subject matter is incredibly dense. Kind of like today's episode. If you want to support me, I've linked my Patreon in the description. There you will get to see the full finished image, an incredibly fast time-lapse of the creation process, bloopers, and possibly vote on what comes next. There could also be cute cat videos of my fur baby Koshik. Who knows? My Twitter is also in the description if you would like to hear my random, usually very incoherent thoughts that I post there. And hitherto, you folks have a wonderful day, and don't do anything that get featured on the news.